The lectionary is brave today. It isn't always. Sometimes it skips or turns aside from difficult or violent passages of Scripture. Whether the editors are trying to protect us or prioritize in limited space the most important parts of the Bible for our regular liturgical reflection, I don't know. But today, we are invited to be brave too. In all honesty, not more so than for any other part of the Sermon on the Mount from which today's passage comes, but the Beatitudes and the exhortation to be salt and light are vague enough to slip by if we wish to. Today's teachings are a little more direct. But let's do it. Let's be brave. Let's face together a challenging passage. Because we believe our living God still speaks to us through our Holy Scripture, and that we can trust that even amidst difficulties, God will not leave us alone or without hope. Our lectionary, the 3-year cycle of Scripture passages for our Sunday service, covers a lot of ground, but it also has to divide passages into manageable excerpts because we hear from multiple books, as we note during our service. And this is especially impactful for most of the books of the New Testament, which were written to be heard in one setting, so one epistle or one gospel. Today's passage is part of the Sermon on the Mount, as I said, and it is insufficient without the rest of that context. I wanted to read you the whole chapter, and I tried to see if I could get away with that, but it took up all the rest of my sermon time. I don't know, it could be argued that that might have been more beneficial for you. We also missed the reading of the Beatitudes in church this year as the feast of the presentation of Jesus at the temple a few weeks ago took precedence. Jesus has called the first disciples in Galilee, and seeing the crowds who have begun to follow, who are looking for healing or for wonders, he goes up a mountain, perhaps not unlike Moses on Sinai, and his disciples follow. The crowd perhaps too, but Matthew doesn't speak to this, and I think this is especially a teaching for Jesus' disciples. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers, and so on. Then last week's passage on being salt and light, we heard from Randy's good sermon and example. Disciples of Jesus are those who preserve what is good and add flavor wherever they are. Disciples shine from the hills and do not allow themselves to be hidden under a bushel basket. Jesus then critiques some of the religious authorities that he tussles with, certain scribes and Pharisees, telling his disciples their righteousness must exceed the others. And then he launches into today's passage. You have heard it said, begins each teaching in the last part of Jesus' sermon here. And just to note, there are 2 more that we will miss because next Sunday happens to be the last last Sunday in the season after Epiphany, which has a different passage. So I hope you will go home today, if I can give you a little homework, and give the whole chapter of 5 a try later today, and I think it'll all come together. In any case, you have heard it said, and his listeners had. He is referencing different teachings from Torah, from the law, and then he's turning them up to 11. Not abolishing them, as he says, but in a rabbinical sort of way, perhaps bringing them to their fullest intention. Sure, don't murder, Jesus says. But I say, if you're angry, be careful. And if you insult someone, you're getting in trouble. And if you cuss someone to the hot place, well, you may just beat them there. We may all be in trouble. Be faithful to your marriage vows. Sure, Jesus says. But if you even look, watch out, mister. Jesus, pastorally, seems to recognize that anger and attraction, psychologically at least, seem to happen beyond much of our control. we do have some more control over what we do with them. And he gives counsel. In conflict, go seek to be reconciled directly, Jesus says, even before you finish your worship at the altar. I'll pause in case anyone needs to leave. No? All right. Deal with it, I hear Jesus telling me, with a raised eyebrow and a look I can't quite avoid. Be brave. I'm with you. And if your eye offends you, well, you will be comforted to know that in the research, most scholars believe that Jesus' advice is hyperbolic. Most. I hope that's so, in which case it might mean something like, if your eye offends you, well, look somewhere else. If you keep burning your hand on something hot, stop touching it. Jesus invites us to consider removing ourselves from the vicinity of the thing that is tempting us to sin. Then we get to Jesus' teaching on divorce. Difficult words, especially without context. After all, who among us hasn't been touched by it, whether in our own lives or in the lives of those whom we care about? Some historical context that I find helpful to remember is that in the first century it was very difficult for a woman to make a living on her own, to survive without being part of a larger family group. And this is why widows are routinely included among the poor and the orphaned in Scripture as those who need extra care. Placing more responsibility on the husband, Jesus' teaching, saying that one can no longer set his wife aside just for any old reason, was something of a progressive protection at the time. He wanted to form a community of disciples, a church family, where no one had to rely on something like marrying someone just to survive, but that they could be who they are and be supported by their family of community. Now, after a long experience as the arbiter that would not allow divorce, in some parts of the church, like ours, it has been more pastorally recognized that sometimes till death do us part is the death of the relationship before any of the people involved. I think this is probably always a sad, though sometimes a necessary thing, which neither the institution nor the vows intend when they are entered, but it still happens. Perhaps it could be said with the statistics out there that some may seek an end before doing their utmost to reconcile, but the details are always so unique and contextual and specific, it's hard to make a blanket statement. If the marriage is dead, then the pastoral logic of our church is that the vows are too, and that there should be a way out. But not all hope is lost, even then. The final teaching of our passage today is easy enough. Don't swear oaths. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. The mere existence of an oath, after all, presumes slyly that we accept that sometimes language is acceptably false or not fully honest. Speak true, Jesus tells his disciples. Easy to say until we need a legal security of a contract. Here's the thing for all of this, though. If these are just extra high ideals, then even with some simple, if not always easy solutions, it just seems to set many of us up for failure. But today's passage requires the context of the whole Sermon on the Mount, because the Sermon on the Mount requires the whole context of the Gospel of Matthew, who writes that the kingdom of heaven is near in Jesus the Christ, the keystone to all of this. The Sermon on the Mount includes ethics, but it's not just a do and a don't list. No. The sermon is the picture of a community of disciples who are living as citizens of the kingdom of heaven in a new way, which they have found in following the Lord. Not as much a test as a gauge. Are we the sort of community of disciples that attracts those who know that they need God's consolations in their life, the meek, the mourning, the poor in spirit? Do we draw peacemakers and the merciful, or do we train them up? Such a place will be the kind of community where people learn to reconcile their anger, where they learn to redirect their improper desires, where we learn to let our language be true without any additional assurance, training our human passions for the service of the kingdom. It's a community in which, if one's marital vows have died, there's no need to make more in order simply to survive or to be able to be a part of a loving family. You can be you on your own, or in our modern pastoral extension even, one can still make vows of commitment and love to another again, if called to do so. And all of that, not because we have to behave in order to earn our reward as if we could. There aren't very many folks I know plucking out their eyes or removing their hands. But because in Jesus Christ we are loved, we are freed to live now in the kingdom which he brought near and fulfilled in his life and his death and his resurrection, despite all the modern-day Caesars who would demand our loyalty instead. Living this way, following Jesus, it puts us at odds with a world that demands that their value be earned, or an eye for an eye instead of reconciliation. And that is what is brave, my friends. Accept that invitation and we will shine like a city on a hill. We will have all the savor of good salt. We will be a place where people know that they are valued, full stop, simply because they are a creature of God and know that everyone else is too. And we live like it. And that's a brave way to live. Not entirely just by choosing, but by allowing ourselves to be drawn along to and with the very one who makes such a life possible. Amen.